No, I'm kidding. This book is totally a green light. Malice by John Gwynne. This book popped high to my TBR after my recent Who Does It the Best video where we discussed writing action, and so many people praised John Gwynne as their favorite action writer. And fantasy fans are pretty opinionated when it comes to writing action. So I went into Malice with the presentation, the title, and it being talked about as this violent book with the expectation that it was like brute fantasy. And that's not what I got. In fact, this was a big surprise in a lot of ways. Before we get into the praise though, I do want to get the setup, some criticisms out of the way, and then we'll just go get into that meatier part of the review. So for setup, this is pretty tropey, typical high fantasy. That's also kind of a criticism, but not as much as you'd think. We'll get into why. We live in a world where there are gods a-stirring, some typical evil ones, some typical really good ones. See where the tropes are coming in? And giants versus man. I actually really like giants versus man. That's like I don't know, it's just cool to have giants. More giants in fantasy, please. I like giants. Giants are neat. Can I say the word giants again? Giants. Love giants. Not the football team. I have no thoughts on the Giants football team, literally none. And we follow a multiple POV cast of characters as they kind of go along a chosen one arc. But I actually do want to refrain from having those tropes sound like a really huge negative part of this review, because John Gwynne has accomplished in actually doing a pretty fresh take on them. This is probably the worst time I could have ever picked up this book, because I've made it very vocally known here on the channel that I am looking for alternative fantasy, stuff that's more unorthodox, and you can't really claim Malice is unorthodox for the genre. But this is a very solid walk down of the paths that we as fantasy fans have come to expect, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, Malice has kind of shifted my mindset to, no, I wasn't really wanting to stop reading these fantasy tropes, I just wanted to see them done better. Maybe Fifth Sorceress really did just leave its mark on me forever. I don't know. I'm cool with a chosen one in a prophecy. It's fine when the author has, something original to add and a cool take on it. Now, the only other really big criticism I want to get in here is, I would say the first that of the book is pretty solidly set up and a bit difficult to get through. The communication with the reader isn't the best. It can be somewhat confusing, but the remaining chunk of the book is going to make you forget about that with how exciting, action-packed, and screw it, wondrous Malice turned out to be. This is fantastic. Some people might complain that the magic system is not more prevalent. I know people really want their to the forefront hard magic systems right now, but this magic system more kind of rests at like a 5. It's right in the middle in between like super soft and super hard. It's kind of just existing in this middle space, and it's not to the front of the text. I would say the magical elements here more fall into the background, and it's more about our main characters living in this brutal Spartan-esque versus giants world. I would say the only actual criticism I have from these more tropey elements is the fact that the theme of good versus evil felt a bit basic, but even then, if you can push past that, you're good to go. I'm just not going to be sitting up at night thinking about the deeper thoughts Malice is making me think, but I don't need it to, and instead I just had a really, really good adventure. This is also a very tight book. There's not much fat here, and coming in at only 600-ish pages, it accomplishes as much as fantasy books with 200 more pages to them. And I really respect John Gwynne for having that restraint. A lot of authors today read like they're just too into telling their own story. They don't know what to cut, what needs to be pulled back on. You won't really be able to remove a single chapter from Malice because each and every single one does such a necessary job of moving the narrative forward. This is as epic or large or grand as books like a Stormlight. It just didn't feel the need to be 800 plus pages. Thank you for that restraint as someone whose full-time job it is to read fantasy. It means a lot to me. Malice is not not going to waste your time. The pacing was really great as well, but let's go ahead and talk about that oh so famous way that John Gwynne is writing action. There's a lot of fantasy that, if you get into the action scenes, they feel like more spectacle than anything else. To me, they kind of just read like Marvel action scenes, where it's not, about the super intense, gritty moments in the fight. It's more about the spectacle around it and the build-up within the story, and I like that. That's great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying writing that kind of action is bad, but that's not how John Gwynne writes his. I would say Malice's action reads more like that long take from Oldboy. You know what I'm talking about? It's so raw, it's so visceral, and it is impactful in every moment. Really grounds everything else here. That's why John Gwynne's action is so praised. I don't know if it's my favorite action of all time ever written. I need to read more by John Gwynne, but it's worth note, and it's something I'm going to be looking for as I proceed through the series, and I definitely will be finishing this series because I like this one enough. And on top of that, this is a world, there are characters here all rich and luscious enough that I could absolutely see myself doing lore deep dives for this series in the future, so keep an eye out for those. The prose aren't on a Tad Williams level, but they are very, very digestible, kind of falling into that modern trend of not trying to reach the highs that fantasy used to rely on for its prose style, and just being this, I guess it actually kind of fits what Malice is, this more direct, straightforward, no BS way of just conveying everything that's happening on the page to the reader, and I can appreciate that. I don't need everyone to read like Guy Gavriel Kay or Rothfuss, and it's totally alright to just kind of focus more on the other elements of your story. And if this had more weak spots in the text, I might have a bigger issue with the prose, but to me, because it's so well put together, I just don't mind as much that this isn't, the most fantastical prose of all time. Now let's talk about real quickly how John Gwynne managed to actually write a lot of fantasy tropes, but not bother me doing it. So there are prophecies, there's chosen ones, there's evil gods, there's good gods, there's the bad race, there's mankind. But what John Gwynne has done with all of that, without getting into spoilers, is add either his own flair to it or a twist. For example, the prophecies. This is usually something that a lot of people groan at now with fantasy, like another prophecy, really? Well, what I can tell you is that he actually managed to make the prophecy feel different. I'm actually going to say it feels more Wheel of Time in terms of his handling of prophecy than anything else. Because if you haven't read the Wheel of Time, the fact that this chosen one is here is not a good thing. It's the bringing about of bad times and similar vibes. In fact, the actual signs from the gods that oh, this is happening are really ominous. And it just felt more like almost like a horror movie setup at times. It really worked for me how intense and looming the prophecy felt. I would rather that than the typical fantasy way of just oh, this prophecy exists. Everyone's kind of oh, about it. And then things begin occurring that just kind of line up with the prophecy. And the wizard's oh yeah, you do these things, you are that. It's nothing more depth there. No, within Malice, the prophecy feels like almost a character in itself, and when events start occurring, there's this feeling of and even the chosen one, without getting too much into his character, there's moral questions raised with how he's viewing his role in the world now that I'm excited to see how the next books are going to get into. And I have a feeling this is a conspiracy theory as a fan now, that we're going to see John Gwynne use these typical tropes to either subvert our expectations and do something a bit different, or to altogether just have a reimagining of how they can progress that feels right for this story. Because I don't think it would necessarily feel right for the story that's being crafted here for everything to play out in the predictable path. And John Gwynne seems to be an author, if I had to take a shot in the dark here, that wants to twist the knife in his readers' back a little bit. There's some author cruelty to the readers, but don't worry, I like that. That got weird. So yeah, that's actually how I'm feeling about Malice overall. I had a lot of fun. There's definitely some mild criticisms and a bit of a slower start here, but overall, definitely worth the read. And I'm going to go ahead and slide into the ratings in terms of character, with how well he developed these characters, with how much they communicate with each other. I actually found myself for once going in the opposite direction of my usual advice. Almost every review I'm no, stop just having the monologue in their head by themselves all the time and tell the reader what's going on. Have them communicate with people and build that way. And that's exactly what John Gwynne did. Almost to the point where I was okay, now we need to go in the other direction a little bit. It's almost all done through characters' understanding of each other, how they view each other, the different ways they view each other depending on the power dynamics. That's such the meat of what you're going to dig into here that is actually to the point where I was like, maybe we need some more processing in this character's head for a minute. But actually, because that's so often the problem, I'm just happy to be over in this camp for once. So character for me, 8.5 out of 10. Memorable, badass characters, and I'll probably be getting to them in character deep dives in the future. Plot's gonna be a bit more because it really depends on how the sequels are going to handle a lot of what's developed here. This is the first in a series, and it kind of suffers from first in a series-itis a bit with how much setup is going on, so I can't go super high. I'm just going to say a 6.5 out of 10. The ending is like more in the 8 territory. It's just that this beginning is kind of more in the 5 realm. So it evens out, but I'm also open to it accelerating to higher highs upon rereads after I get later in the series. Pacing, again, there's this beginning chunk that I found a bit confusing, a bit muddled, but it just flew and became so fantastic. It's just night and day for me with the beginning versus the second half of the book. I'm going to say it averages out to about a 7. I think it's actually so good on the latter half pacing-wise that I'm just going to largely forgive that first beginning. And then themes, probably the weakest part of this book so far. I'm hoping later ones make me think a bit more, but I don't find myself sitting up at night thinking about the questions asked in Malice. It's pretty standard good versus evil with some muddling here and there so far, but nothing that's making me go, huh? So that, I'm not going to put a rating on theme, but that's my general thought on it. Now let's switch over to the quantity ratings. These are not about how good these elements are in the book, just about how prevalent they are, because I know a lot of fantasy fans really care about different levels of all these elements within their books. Magic's going to actually be pretty low. While I liked his more middle-of-the-road magic system that's not super hard or super soft, it just feels very fantastical to me. It doesn't play a huge role yet. I would say it's probably like a 4 out of 10 in terms of prevalence. It's there. It plays a role, you're going to be aware of it, but by no means is it in every single line of text or dialogue or relevant all the time to what's happening in the pages. Violence. While I adore the way it's written, Malice isn't as bloody as I thought it was going to be. God, I loved how it was written though, but in terms of overall prevalence, 7 out of 10. It's a pretty violent book, but it's not the most violent fantasy book I've read. And then the fantasy world. This is a high fantasy story, and I'm going to say it actually falls into the upper echelon of just really well developed within one books, especially for the page count fantasy territory. I'm going to give it a 8 out of 10. I really felt immersed in this world. It was presented very well to the reader. There's tons to dig into on the political side, on the mystical side, creature aspects, the culture. There's no pulled punches for developing this world. It's not in the S tier of fantasy worlds I've seen developed in one book, but it's notable, and I'm excited to learn more about this world as I get deeper into the series. And overall, for Malice, I am feeling a 7 out of 10. And something I want to add into my reviews here that I haven't done before, and I'm curious to see if you guys like this segment or not, is if you'd like X, you might like this. What do I think compares to reading Malice? Well, there's a pretty obvious crossover with I think First Law fans would have a good time with this one, as well as the Song of Ice and Fire crowd, though Malice isn't as, despite the title implying, dark as those series, at least yet. And I also see quite a bit of appeal for the high fantasy fans. If you like Rhyria Revelations, this one could be for you. Even the more classic leaning style stuff like Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, there's a lot of appeal for quite a lot here. The only people I say wouldn't have some kind of inkling to enjoying Malice were those who are purely in it for the, hard magic systems to the forefront, bombastic, over-the-top, cinematic action. This is more grounded than what you'll get there. Anyway, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.